Lecture 7, Buddha. Siddhartha Gautama lived from 563–483 BC, was a contemporary of Mahavira, the founder of Jainism. He was also a fellow Indian. Siddhartha, later renamed Buddha, proposed an alternative spiritual path which he considered moderate in comparison with Jainism and other highly ascetical religions. For this reason, Buddha considered his religious path to be a middle way that stands between extreme asceticism and hedonism. In studying Buddhism, we will first take a glance at the life of its founder and his confrontation with the reality of suffering. Then you will be introduced to the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. We will go deeper in the fourth noble truth by focusing on the eightfold path of ending suffering, which entails a code of ethics adaptable to one's station in life. Buddha. According to the Indian writer Asvaghosha, lived from 80 to 150 AD, in The Acts of the Buddha, Siddhartha was born into a royal family called Sakyas, who ruled in the city of Kapilavastu, located in modern-day Nepal. He was slated to inherit his father's kingdom. Despite his father's efforts to shield him from the harsh realities of life and pamper him with sensual pleasures, Siddhartha was confronted with pain and death, including the fleetingness of sexual love which many beautiful women offered to him. He disappointed them, and I quote, "And the women, having worn their garlands and ornaments in vain, with their graceful arts and endearments all fruitless, concealing their love deep in their hearts, returned to the city with broken hopes." End of quote. His father was hoping to turn his son away from the pursuit of deeper meaning in life through the beauty of women, quote, "could not lie down all that night, like an elephant with an arrow in its heart. But wearied in all sorts of consultation, he and his ministers could find no other means beside these despised pleasures to restrain his son's purpose." End of quote. As described by Asvaghosha, Siddhartha, quote, "the son of the Sakya king, even though thus tempted by the objects of sense which infatuate others, yielded not to pleasure, and felt no delight, like a lion deeply pierced in his heart by a poisoned arrow." End of quote. Deciding that the life his father had in mind for him was vain, he fled to take up the life of an ascetic. According to the Acts of the Buddha, for 6 years Siddhartha vainly tried to attain merit. He practiced self-mortification, performing many rules of abstinence hard for a man to carry out. End of quote. At the end of the 6 years, he deemed his fasting and other ascetical practices as, quote, "not the way to passionlessness, nor to perfect knowledge, nor to liberation." End of quote. He concluded that only through, quote, "contemplation are obtained those conditions through which is eventually gained that supreme calm, undecaying, immortal state which is so hard to be reached." End of quote. Then he sat down under the Bodhi tree with the intention of discovering in meditation perfect knowledge. Then, records the Act of the Buddha, he sat down on his hams in a posture immovably firm, and with his limbs gathered into a mass like a sleeping serpent's hood, exclaiming, "I will not rise from this position on the earth until I have obtained my utmost aim." During his meditation, he remembered his thousands of deaths and rebirths. As he relived these transmigrations, he grew in compassion, quote, "for all living beings." End of quote. His experience of being enlightened earned him the name Buddha, which comes from the Sanskrit word bodhati, meaning is awake, observes, understands. End of quote. After experiencing this high state of consciousness, he felt impelled to pass into nirvana and ceased experiencing rebirth and death by remaining in a mentally immobile state. Instead, he chose the way of compassion and stayed on earth in order to pass on his way of life to others. When he had sufficiently taught the middle way of enlightenment, he died and entered into nirvana, and according to Buddhist doctrine was saved by being freed from suffering. According to the later Mahayana school of Buddhism, once passing into nirvana, the Buddha became transformed into a cosmic body that encompasses the universe, which at times intervenes in its affairs in order to assist others on the path to enlightenment. Other schools, sometimes called Old Wisdom School or Hinayana, equate nirvana with, quote, total self-extinction, end of quote. The idea of the Siddhartha Buddha as a savior, consequently, is more pronounced in the Mahayana school. In contrasting Buddhist salvation with Christian salvation, Pope St. John Paul, in Crossing the Threshold of Hope, writes this, I quote, "The Buddhist doctrine of salvation constituted the central point, or rather the only point of his system. Nevertheless, both the Buddhist tradition and the methods deriving from it have an almost exclusively negative soteriology. The enlightenment experienced by Buddha comes down to the conviction that the world is bad, that it is the source of evil and of suffering for man. To liberate oneself from this evil, one must free oneself from this world, necessitating a break with the ties that join us to external reality, ties existing in our human nature, in our psyche, in our bodies. The more we are liberated from these ties, the more we become indifferent to what is in the world, and the more we are freed from suffering, from the evil that has its source in the world. Do we draw near to God in this way? That is not mentioned in the enlightenment conveyed by Buddha. Buddhism is in large measure an atheistic system, godless. We do not free ourselves from evil through the good which comes from God. We liberate ourselves only through detachment from the world which is bad. The fullness of such detachment is not union with God, but what is called nirvana, a state of perfect indifference with regard to the world. To save oneself means, above all, to free oneself from evil by becoming indifferent to the world, which is the source of evil. This is the culmination of the spiritual process." End of quote. Four Noble Truths. After his enlightenment, the Buddha, in his first post-enlightenment lesson, gave the following teaching to his disciples. In it are contained what is referred to as the Four Noble Truths. These four assertions are commonly considered, explains the Buddhist dictionary, quote, the briefest synthesis of the entire teachings of Buddhism, since all those manifold doctrines of the threefold canon are without exception included therein. They are 1. The truth of suffering, 2. The origin of suffering, 3. The extinction of suffering, and 4. The eightfold path leading to the extinction of suffering. End of quote. These four can be categorized as sickness, the cause of sickness, the cure in a general way, and the cure specified. The sickness is suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. The cure in a general way is rejecting desire. The cure, when specified, entails practicing the eightfold path, which includes right thinking, right acting, and right willing. And I'm going to quote from The Wheel of Truth on the Four Noble Truths. 1. Suffering as a noble truth is this. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow and lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering. Association with the loathed is suffering, disassociation from the loved is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. In short, suffering is the 5 categories of clinging objects. 2. The origin of suffering as a noble truth is this. It is the craving that produces renewal of being, accompanied by enjoyment and lust, and enjoying this and that, in other words, craving for sensual desires, craving for being, craving for non-being. 3. Cessation of suffering as a noble truth is this. It is remainderless, fading and ceasing, giving up, relinquishing, letting go, and rejecting of that same craving. 4. The way leading to cessation of suffering as a noble truth is this. It is simply the noble eightfold path, that is to say, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. End of quote. The Eightfold Path. In his first post-enlightenment speech, the Buddha succinctly enumerates the means to use in striving for enlightenment and nirvana. He states, quote, "It is the noble eightfold path, and nothing else, namely, right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This is the middle path realized by Tathagata, the Buddha, which gives vision, which gives knowledge, and leads to calm, to insight, to enlightenment, and to nirvana. End of quote. Moral Precepts 5, 8, and 10. Siddhartha Buddha's moderate middle path allowed for the development of various moral codes according to one's role. And in the transcript, I list 3 such training codes for a Theravada branch of Buddhism. And I'll read the first 2, which are associated with the laity. They apply to the laity. 5 moral precepts for the laity. 1. No arms trading, no human trafficking, avoid meat, avoid alcohol, avoid poison. And 8 moral precepts for the laity. Avoid killing living beings, no stealing, no sexual misconduct, no lying, no backbiting, no harsh and angry speech, no gossip, no immoral employment. The 10 moral precepts for monks and nuns are as follows. 1. I undertake the training rule to refrain from taking life. 2. I undertake the training rule to refrain from stealing. 3. I undertake the training rule to refrain from sexual intercourse. 4. I undertake the training rule to refrain from telling lies. 5. I undertake the training rule to refrain from intoxicating fermented and distilled beverages that lead to carelessness. 6. I undertake the training rule to refrain from eating at the wrong time. 7. I undertake the training rule to refrain from dancing, singing, music, and watching shows. 8. I undertake the training rule to refrain from wearing garlands and beautifying myself with perfumes and cosmetics. 9. I undertake the training rule to refrain from high and luxurious seats and beds. I undertake, and number 10, I undertake the training rule to refrain from accepting gold and money. God bless.